Officer Bradley Kincaid had been on the force for years. He thought he had seen it all. To him, certain neighborhoods were always trouble, and he believed he knew who belonged and who didn't. It was just another afternoon on patrol when he spotted a man standing near a sleek black car, checking his phone. Something about the man's confidence annoyed Kincaid. He wasn't dressed like the usual people he saw in this area. His suit was too sharp, his posture too calm. In Kincaid's mind, that meant trouble. Without hesitation, Kincaid pulled his squad car to the curb and stepped out. His partner, a rookie officer named Ruiz, hesitated before following. "Sir, can I help you with something?" the man asked, his deep voice steady. Kincaid didn't like the way he spoke, too sure of himself. He narrowed his eyes and folded his arms. "Yeah, you can start by showing me some ID," he said, stepping closer. The man gave a small sigh, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Is there a reason you're asking for it?" Kincaid's patience wore thin. "I don't have to explain myself. Just hand it over." Ruiz glanced between them, shifting uncomfortably. Something about this felt off. The man didn't look nervous or guilty. He looked irritated, and that wasn't the reaction Ruiz usually saw in situations like this. "I don't think that's necessary," the man said, still calm. "Unless I'm being detained." That was it. Kincaid's temper snapped. "Are you getting smart with me?" he barked, stepping forward. The man barely flinched, but his steady gaze only made Kincaid angrier. Without another word, Kincaid shoved him back. A few bystanders gasped, and someone pulled out a phone. The man stumbled slightly but didn't retaliate. "That was unnecessary," he said, voice still measured. Kincaid wasn't listening. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Put your hands behind your back." "For what?" "For resisting an officer," Kincaid snapped. A small crowd was gathering now, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air thickened. The man didn't move right away, and something about his steady posture made Kincaid even angrier. Without thinking, Kincaid's fist shot forward, connecting hard with the man's jaw. The impact sent him stumbling back, his hand touching his face in shock. A woman nearby screamed. Phones were recording from all angles now. Ruiz's stomach dropped. The man straightened slowly, wiping the corner of his mouth. His eyes locked onto Kincaid's, and this time, there was no patience left. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that made even Kincaid pause. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Kincaid scoffed, but something in his gut twisted. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived, but as soon as the officers stepped out of their cars and saw the man's face, their expressions changed. Some looked shocked, others terrified. And then, in a voice thick with disbelief, one of them muttered, "Oh no, that's him." Phones were out everywhere, recording everything. People in the crowd whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the man on the ground and Officer Kincaid, who still stood with his fists clenched. Kincaid, however, wasn't thinking about them. His focus was on the man in front of him, the same man he had just punched. But something felt wrong. The way people reacted, it wasn't just about the punch, it was something else. Ruiz stood frozen. His training told him to intervene, but fear held him back. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had seen minor stops before, but this was different. The man Kincaid had hit wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening. He was just standing there, wiping his jaw, staring back with an expression Ruiz couldn't quite read. Then the sirens grew louder. 2 more squad cars pulled up. Officers stepped out, but instead of rushing to support Kincaid, they hesitated. One of them, Lieutenant Rodriguez, the highest-ranking officer on the scene, took a sharp breath the moment he saw the man standing there. His face shifted from confusion to realization, then to something close to panic. "Oh no," Rodriguez muttered under his breath. "That's him." Kincaid's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Rodriguez didn't answer. He rushed forward and did something that stunned everyone. Instead of looking at Kincaid, he turned to the man on the ground and spoke with urgency. "Sir, are you all right?" The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Kincaid blinked. "Sir, why was Rodriguez speaking to him like that?" The man dusted off his suit and nodded. "I'm fine," he said simply, but his voice carried weight. Rodriguez turned back to Kincaid, his jaw tight. "Uncuff him. Now." Kincaid scoffed. "Are you kidding me?" This guy was resisting. Rodriguez took a deep breath, clearly trying to stay calm. "You don't know who this is, do you?" Kincaid rolled his eyes. "Why should I care?" Rodriguez's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with slow and deliberate words, he said, "Because, Officer Kincaid, this is Captain Jamal Carter." For the first time, Kincaid felt his stomach drop. "Captain?" That wasn't possible. He looked at the man again, as if seeing him for the first time. His sharp suit, his composed manner, the way everyone, even superior officers, were reacting to him. It all clicked too late. Jamal Carter wasn't just any man. He was their new commanding officer. The crowd had gone from murmuring to full-out recording every second. Ruiz took a small step back, his heartbeat racing. This wasn't just a bad stop. This was a disaster. Kincaid's fingers twitched, but his voice was defensive. I didn't know." Jamal didn't respond right away. He simply stared at him, his face unreadable. Then, in a voice that sent a chill through Kincaid, he said, "But you should have." The weight of his words hung in the air as the reality of what Kincaid had done started to sink in. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Kincaid had ever felt before. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. Their phones were still recording, capturing every second of the moment. Kincaid's mind raced, but his body stayed still. He had just punched a man who turned out to be his new captain. His superior. His boss. The realization made his stomach twist, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. Lieutenant Rodriguez was glaring at him now. "Uncuff him," he ordered again, his voice sharp. Kincaid hesitated, but one look at Rodriguez's face told him he had no choice. He reached for the cuffs, unlocking them with stiff hands. As soon as the metal restraints were off, Jamal Carter rubbed his wrists but said nothing. He didn't need to. The way he stood, the way he carried himself, he had already taken control of the situation without raising his voice. Ruiz stepped back, his heart pounding. He had never seen anything like this. Kincaid had always been the loudest officer in the room, the one who barked orders and expected everyone to follow. But now he looked smaller. Rodriguez turned to Carter, his expression a mix of regret and frustration. "Sir, Carter raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Not here," he said calmly. His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm. "We'll handle this at the precinct." Kincaid swallowed hard. The precinct. That meant this wasn't over. The crowd erupted in quiet murmurs. Some were whispering, others shaking their heads. A few even clapped, as if justice had already been served. As Carter turned to leave, Kincaid couldn't help himself. His pride wouldn't let him stay silent. "I didn't know who you were," he blurted out. Carter paused but didn't turn around. The street felt like it was holding its breath. Then, after a long moment, he finally spoke. "And that's the problem." Those 4 words hit harder than any punch ever could. Kincaid felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck as Carter walked away, stepping into one of the squad cars. Rodriguez shot Kincaid one last look before following him. Ruiz hesitated, then placed a hand on Kincaid's shoulder. "You messed up," he said quietly. Kincaid jerked his shoulder away, his jaw tight. "Shut up, kid," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew Ruiz was right. The squad cars pulled away, leaving behind a street full of witnesses and a once confident officer who was now standing in the middle of the road, unsure of what to do next. For the first time in his career, Bradley Kincaid felt fear, not of the people he had always judged, Not of the department, but of what would happen when he walked through those precinct doors. The ride back to the precinct was silent. Officer Kincaid sat in his squad car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been on the force for years, always in control, always the one calling the shots. But now, everything had changed. As he pulled into the precinct parking lot, he could already see officers gathering near the entrance, talking in hushed voices. The news had spread fast. He could feel their eyes on him as he stepped out of his car. Some looked at him with shock, others with amusement, and a few with something close to satisfaction. Inside, the tension was even worse. The moment Kincaid walked in, all conversations stopped. Officers turned their heads, pretending to be busy, but he knew they were listening. He clenched his jaw and walked straight ahead, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. At the end of the corridor, Captain Jamal Carter stood with Lieutenant Rodriguez. Carter was calm, his expression unreadable. But there was a weight in his presence that filled the entire room. "Kincaid," Rodriguez said, his voice clipped. "In my office." "Now." Kincaid nodded stiffly and followed them inside. The door shut behind him with a quiet click, but it felt louder than it should have. Rodriguez didn't sit down. Neither did Carter. They stood, facing Kincaid, making it clear this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Do you understand the situation you're in?" Rodriguez asked, crossing his arms. Kincaid forced himself to meet his lieutenant's eyes. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't know who he was." Carter finally spoke, "And that's the problem." Kincaid flinched. He had heard those same words back on the street, but they hit even harder now. Carter took a step closer. "Tell me, Officer Kincaid, what exactly made you think I was a threat? Was it the way I was standing? The way I was dressed? The fact that I was in that neighborhood?" Kincaid hesitated. He wanted to say something, anything, that would make this better. But the truth was, he didn't have a good answer. Carter didn't wait for him to respond. "I was standing by my own car, not breaking any laws, not causing any problems. And yet you approached me with force, assumed I was up to something. And when I questioned you, you hit me." Rodriguez shook his head. "Do you realize how bad this looks? This isn't just an officer making a bad call. This is an officer abusing his power in front of witnesses." Kincaid felt his stomach twist. It wasn't about power. "It was," Carter interrupted, his voice sharp. "And it's not the first time, is it?" Kincaid's mouth went dry. Rodriguez sighed. "Internal Affairs is looking into this. You better hope you have a good explanation, because right now it doesn't look good for you." Kincaid swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he would still have a job tomorrow. Kincaid sat in the chair across from Lieutenant Rodriguez's desk, feeling trapped. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in on him. He had been in this room many times before, but never like this. Never as the one under investigation. Captain Jamal Carter stood near the window, arms crossed. His presence alone made the air in the room feel heavy. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten. The weight of what had happened was already pressing down on Kincaid like a storm about to break. Rodriguez sighed and opened a file on his desk. "Kincaid, Internal Affairs has pulled your record. Do you know how many complaints have been filed against you over the years?" Kincaid shifted uncomfortably. "A few," he muttered. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. "Not a few. 15. Kincaid's stomach dropped. He knew he had complaints, but he hadn't realized it was that many. Rodriguez continued, flipping through the pages. Excessive force, wrongful stops, disrespect toward civilians. And until now, there was never enough evidence to take action. But this time, it was recorded. By multiple witnesses. And you didn't just rough up some random citizen. You assaulted your own captain." Kincaid clenched his jaw. "I didn't know who he was," he repeated. Carter finally turned around. His eyes were sharp, filled with something Kincaid couldn't quite read. "And if I wasn't your captain? If I was just another man on the street, what would have happened?" Kincaid didn't have an answer. He knew the truth, but saying it out loud would only make things worse. Rodriguez leaned forward. "Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation. Until then, you're suspended without pay." The words hit Kincaid like a punch to the gut. Suspended. He shot up from his chair. "You can't be serious. I've been on the force for years. I've put my life on the line." Rodriguez slammed the file shut. "And that's exactly why this is happening. We can't have officers who think like you walking around with a badge and a gun." Kincaid's face burned with anger, but deep down, fear was creeping in. He had always thought himself untouchable, that no matter what happened, the department would have his back. But now, he was realizing just how alone he was. Carter stepped forward. "You're lucky this is just suspension and not immediate termination." Kincaid swallowed hard, his mind racing. If Internal Affairs found him guilty, he wouldn't just lose his job. His career, his reputation, everything he had built would be gone. Rodriguez stood up. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave." For a long moment, Kincaid didn't move. Then, with stiff fingers, he unclipped his badge, set it on the desk, and placed his gun beside it. As he turned to leave, Carter's voice topped him. "You thought you were above consequences, Kincaid." Kincaid didn't look back. He just walked out, knowing that for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control anymore. Kincaid walked out of the precinct with his head down. The weight of everything that had happened was settling in, and for the first time in his career, he had no idea what was coming next. He had always believed that his job was secure, that no matter what, the department would back him up. But now, without his badge and gun, he felt exposed. As he stepped outside, he noticed a group of officers talking near the entrance. The moment they saw him, their conversation stopped. Some of them looked away, pretending not to notice him, while others exchanged knowing glances. He wasn't sure what was worse, the ones who ignored him or the ones who looked like they had been waiting for this moment. Officer Ruiz stood nearby, leaning against a squad car. Unlike the others, he didn't look smug or pleased. He just looked disappointed. "You really messed up," Ruiz said quietly as Kincaid walked past him. Kincaid clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. What was he supposed to say? That he hadn't meant for this to happen? That he didn't think it was a big deal? None of that would change the situation. He got into his car and sat there for a long moment. The reality of his suspension was sinking in. No job, no paycheck, no authority. He had spent years building a career based on control, but now he had none. Meanwhile, back inside the precinct, Captain Jamal Carter stood in front of a room full of officers. His presence alone was enough to make the room silent. Every officer in the department had heard about what happened, and now they were waiting to see how Carter would handle it. "I know many of you have questions," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me make one thing clear. What happened today is not just about one officer making a bad call. It's about the culture we allow to exist in this department." A few officers shifted in their seats. Some nodded, others remained silent. "We are supposed to protect and serve," Carter continued, "not judge people based on where they are or what they look like. That ends today." Lieutenant Rodriguez stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. The message was clear. Change was coming, whether people liked it or not. Ruiz, sitting near the back of the room, felt something shift inside him. He had joined the force because he wanted to do good, but moments like today had made him question everything. Now, for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As the meeting ended, Carter turned to Rodriguez. "Keep an eye on the investigation. If we let this slide, nothing will ever change." Rodriguez nodded. "Understood, Captain." Outside, Kincaid was still sitting in his car, staring at the precinct building. He had always believed he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, he was starting to wonder if this was just the beginning of his downfall. The precinct buzzed with tension. The news had spread beyond just the department. Social media was on fire, and the video of Kincaid punching Captain Jamal Carter had gone viral. The entire city was watching, and the pressure was mounting. Everyone knew Internal Affairs was about to release its findings, and no one could predict what would happen next. Meanwhile, Kincaid sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone. His suspension had left him with nothing to do but watch the world react. Every news station was talking about him. Some people defended him, saying he was just doing his job, while others called for his immediate firing. He saw the video of himself over and over again. The moment he threw the punch, the shock on Carter's face, the reactions of the bystanders. Each time he watched, his stomach twisted. A knock at his door made him sit up. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Officer Ruiz standing there. "Ruiz?" Kincaid frowned. "What are you doing here?" Ruiz hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. "I wanted to talk." Kincaid sighed and rubbed his face. "If you're here to lecture me, don't bother." Ruiz shook his head. "I'm not here to lecture you, but I need to ask, do you even understand what you did?" Kincaid exhaled, frustration creeping into his voice. "I made a mistake, all right. I didn't know who he was." Ruiz looked at him for a long moment. "But that's not the point, is it?" Kincaid felt a flicker of anger. "What do you want me to say, Ruiz? That I regret it? Fine, I regret it. But I've been on the force for years. I've done my job." Ruiz shook his head. "You don't get it." He glanced at the TV, where another news segment about the incident was playing. "People are talking about this because it wasn't just one bad decision. It was years of decisions, and now it's finally caught up with you." Kincaid scoffed. "So, what? You think I deserve this?" Ruiz hesitated. "I think you had chances to change, and you didn't take them." Kincaid didn't respond. He didn't like hearing it, but deep down, he knew Ruiz was right. He had been warned before. There had been complaints, reports, conversations with supervisors, but he had never taken them seriously because nothing ever happened. Until now. Ruiz sighed. Internal Affairs is announcing their decision tomorrow. If you care at all about your career, maybe it's time to take some responsibility. With that, he turned and left, leaving Kincaid standing alone in his doorway. The room felt quieter than before. Kincaid sat back down, staring at his badge on the table. He had always thought he was untouchable. Now, for the first time, he realized that no one was above consequences. And tomorrow, he would finally face his. The next morning, the precinct was unusually quiet. Officers gathered near the television in the break room, waiting for the announcement. Internal Affairs had reviewed the case, and now, the entire department, and the city, would finally know Kincaid's fate. Kincaid sat alone at home, staring at the screen. His stomach felt heavy, but his face was emotionless. He had barely slept the night before, thinking about what Ruiz had said, thinking about every decision he had made that led to this moment. The news anchor appeared on the screen. After a full investigation, Internal Affairs has reached a decision regarding Officer Bradley Kincaid's actions. Due to his use of excessive force, multiple prior complaints, and the assault on Captain Jamal Carter, Kincaid has been officially terminated from the police force. Kincaid's heart sank. The anchor continued. The department released a statement saying this decision reflects their commitment to accountability and fair policing. Captain Jamal Carter also spoke, saying, "This is not about one officer. It's about making sure justice applies to everyone, no matter who they are." The TV showed Carter speaking at a press conference, his face calm and steady. He wasn't celebrating Kincaid's downfall. He wasn't angry. He was simply stating the facts. Kincaid turned off the TV and buried his face in his hands. It was over. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Some officers were relieved. Others were shocked. Ruse stood quietly near his desk, watching Carter as he addressed the team. "This is a wake-up call for all of us," Carter said. "This department has to do better. And that starts today." There was no applause, no cheering, just the quiet understanding that things had changed. And they weren't going back to the way they were before. Outside, Kincaid stepped onto his small balcony and looked at the city he had once sworn to protect. He had always thought himself as someone in control, someone untouchable. But now he had lost everything because of his own choices. For the first time in his life, there was no badge to hide behind, no uniform to give him power. Just a man standing alone, realizing too late that his actions had consequences. As the city moved on without him, he finally understood. Respect isn't given by force. It's earned.